I'd been studying ocean anomalies for 12 years, but nothing in my research had prepared me for the deep blue hole. The reports crossed my desk 3 weeks ago, a massive circular void in the Pacific, roughly 200 miles southwest of the Mariana Trench. According to the preliminary data, it was a perfect circle about half a mile across, and every attempt to measure its depth had failed. The sonar readings just stopped at a certain point, like the sound waves were hitting nothing at all. When the Research Foundation offered me a spot on the expedition, I jumped at the chance. This was exactly the kind of mystery that had drawn me to oceanography in the first place. Strange formations, unexplained phenomena. That's where real discoveries happened. The research vessel, Deep Current, was bigger than I'd expected. About 200 feet long with enough equipment to run a small university's marine biology department. I arrived at the dock in San Diego on a Tuesday morning, carrying my duffel bag and laptop case. The crew was already loading supplies, and I could hear the diesel engines warming up. "You must be Dr. Chen," someone called out as I walked up the gangway. I turned to see a woman in her early 40s approaching, wearing navy blue expedition gear and work boots. She had graying brown hair pulled back tight and the kind of weathered face that came from years of deep-sea work. "I'm Dr. Rebecca Henslow, mission leader and your pilot for this little adventure." I shook her hand, noticing the firm grip. "Good to meet you. I've read your work on deep-sea pressure systems. Impressive stuff." "Thanks. Hope you're ready for something completely different this time." She gestured toward the stern where a submersible sat secured to the deck. "That's our ride down. Benthic Explorer. She's rated for depths up to 20,000 feet, though we might be testing those limits." The submersible looked like a white metal sphere with viewing ports attached to a framework of thrusters and equipment pods. I'd been in similar vessels before, but this one seemed more heavily reinforced than usual. "How deep are we expecting to go?" I asked. "That's the million-dollar question," Rebecca said. "Previous expeditions couldn't find the bottom. Sonar just stops working at a certain depth. We're going to try a different approach, direct observation." A younger man jogged over, carrying a tablet and looking slightly out of breath. He had reddish-brown hair and pale skin, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested too much caffeine. "Dr. Chen, I'm James Callahan, equipment specialist. I'll be running the scientific instruments during the dive." "What kind of readings have you been getting from the surface?" I asked. James pulled up some data on his tablet, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. "That's what's so weird about this thing. Normal ocean currents just stop at the edge of the hole. Water temperature drops about 15 degrees in a perfect circle. And the marine life, there isn't any. Fish won't go near it, whales change course to avoid it. Even plankton levels drop to zero, right at the boundary." I studied the charts he showed me. The data didn't make sense from an oceanographic perspective. Ocean currents didn't just stop. They were driven by temperature differences, salinity, and the Earth's rotation. For them to halt at a specific boundary suggested something was actively interfering with normal water movement. "What about geological surveys?" I asked. "Any seismic activity in the area?" "Nothing," James said. "The ocean floor around the hole is completely normal. Typical abyssal plain sediment, normal mineral composition. But right at the edge, everything changes. It's like someone drew a line and said, 'Physics stops here.'" Rebecca led us toward the bridge where the captain was reviewing navigation charts. The crew moved around us with practiced efficiency, securing equipment and running final checks. I noticed something odd. The sailors kept their voices low when they talked about the hole, and more than once I caught them glancing nervously toward the horizon. "Captain Morrison," Rebecca called out. "This is Dr. Chen, our oceanographer." The captain was a weathered man in his 50s with gray hair and deep-set eyes. He nodded at me but didn't smile. "Doctor, hope you know what you're getting into down there." "Just another deep-sea dive," I said. "I've been to the bottom of the Puerto Rico Trench. How different can this be?" Morrison and Rebecca exchanged a look. "The Puerto Rico Trench is just deep water," Morrison said. "This thing, my crew's been talking to other sailors who've been near it. They say it feels wrong, like the ocean itself is afraid of it." I almost laughed, but something in his expression stopped me. Morrison had probably spent 30 years at sea. Sailors that experienced didn't spook easily. "What do you mean, feels wrong?" I asked. "Hard to explain," Morrison said. "Water doesn't move right near it. Compass needles start spinning, electronics act up, and the sound." He shook his head. "There's no sound at all. Dead quiet, like the ocean's holding its breath." Rebecca checked her watch. "We should reach the coordinates in about 6 hours. That'll give us time to run final equipment checks and review the dive plan." I spent the next few hours going over the mission parameters with James. Our primary objective was to descend into the hole and document whatever we found. Secondary goals included water sampling, geological surveys, and mapping the void's structure. The plan was straightforward: go down until we hit bottom or reached our depth limits, then return to the surface. The weird thing is the water displacement, James explained as we reviewed the data. A hole this size should affect ocean levels for hundreds of miles around. But satellite measurements show normal sea levels everywhere except right at the hole itself. "That's impossible," I said. "Water doesn't just disappear. If there's a void this large, the surrounding water has to flow in to fill it." "That's what we thought too. But look at these current measurements." He showed me a series of charts. Water approaches the hole normally, then just stops, like it hits an invisible wall. I studied the data, trying to find some explanation that fit known physics. Ocean water was constantly in motion, driven by temperature, salinity, and gravitational forces. For it to simply stop moving violated everything I understood about fluid dynamics. The ship's intercom crackled to life. "All hands, we're approaching the target coordinates. Research team to the deck for visual confirmation." I followed Rebecca and James outside. The afternoon sun was bright, and the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then Rebecca pointed ahead. "There," she said. "About 2 miles out." I squinted against the glare and saw it, a perfect circle of darker water, like a shadow on the ocean surface. As we got closer, the difference became more pronounced. The water inside the circle was completely still, while normal waves continued right up to the edge. "Jesus," I muttered. "It really is a perfect circle." The boundary was sharp enough to draw with a ruler. On one side, normal Pacific Ocean with small waves and natural movement. On the other side, water so still it looked like black glass. The contrast was unsettling, like looking at a photograph where someone had erased part of the image. "Depth readings?" Rebecca called out. James checked his instruments. "Sonar's working normally until..." "Wait." He frowned at the display. "I'm getting readings down to about 8,000 feet, then nothing. It's like the sound waves just disappear." I walked to the rail and stared down at the dark water. The hole was enormous, easily 1/2 mile across, just like the reports had said. But seeing it in person was different. There was something fundamentally wrong about it, something that made my brain struggle to process what I was looking at. "Water temperature?" I asked. 15 degrees colder inside the boundary, James confirmed. "Salinity's normal, but there's no current movement at all. It's like the water's frozen in place." Rebecca joined me at the rail. "Still think it's just another deep-sea dive?" I didn't answer immediately. The hole defied everything I knew about oceanography, but that's exactly why we were here. Science advanced by investigating the impossible and finding explanations. "Let's get the submersible ready," I said finally. "Whatever's down there, we're going to find it." The crew spent the next hour preparing the benthic Explorer for launch. I watched them run through safety checks, test communication systems, and verify life support equipment. The submersible could keep 3 people alive for up to 12 hours, with emergency reserves for another 6. Rebecca ran through the pre-dive checklist while James loaded scientific equipment into the cargo compartments. Water sampling containers, geological survey tools, cameras and sensor arrays. Everything we'd need to document whatever we found in the depths. "Communication range is about 5,000 feet, Rebecca explained. "After that, we'll be on our own until we surface. Emergency ascent takes approximately 40 minutes from maximum depth." I climbed into the submersible and took my position at the observation station. The interior was cramped but functional, with 3 seats arranged around the central viewing port. Rebecca settled into the pilot's chair while James took the equipment station. "All systems green," James reported, checking his displays. "Life support nominal. Power at full capacity." Rebecca started the descent sequence. "Deep current. This is benthic Explorer. Beginning dive operations." "Copy that, benthic Explorer. You're clear for descent. Good hunting down there." The submersible detached from the ship and began sinking toward the dark water below. I watched through the viewing port as we approached the boundary between normal ocean and the mysterious void. I settled into my seat inside the benthic Explorer, adjusting the safety harness across my chest. The submersible felt cramped with all 3 of us packed inside, but the equipment was impressive. Banks of monitors, control panels, and scientific instruments lined every available surface. Rebecca took the pilot's position up front, while James squeezed into the equipment station behind me. "All systems green," Rebecca announced, her hands moving across the control panel with practiced efficiency. Sealing the hatch now. The heavy clunk of the hatch locking into place made everything feel final. We were committed now. Through the thick porthole beside me, I could see the crew of the Deep Current securing the launch cables. The diesel engines rumbled somewhere above us as the ship positioned itself over our target coordinates. "Initiating descent," Rebecca said. "We'll take it slow until we reach the anomaly." The submersible lurched slightly as the winch system lowered us into the water. I watched the surface disappear above us, replaced by the familiar blue-green of the Pacific. Schools of fish scattered as we descended, their silver bodies catching the filtered sunlight. James was already busy with his instruments, checking readings and making notes on his tablet. "Water temperature's normal so far," he reported. 22 degrees Celsius at this depth. Salinity levels are standard. I pressed my face closer to the porthole, watching the ocean around us. Everything looked normal, the way water should behave at this depth. Particles drifted past in the current, and I could see the occasional jellyfish pulsing through the water column. "How far out are we from the coordinates?" I asked. Rebecca checked her navigation display. "About half a mile. We should start seeing changes soon if the reports are accurate." The submersible continued its steady descent, the water outside growing darker as we moved deeper. I'd done dozens of dives like this over the years, but something felt different today. Maybe it was knowing what we were heading toward, or maybe it was the nervous energy radiating from James behind me. "Current speed is dropping," Rebecca noted, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "We're at about 2 knots now. Should be closer to 4 at this depth." I looked out the porthole again. The particles I'd been watching seemed to be moving more slowly, almost drifting instead of flowing with the current. A piece of kelp floated past, barely moving at all. "That's not normal," I said. "No, it's not." Rebecca adjusted our heading slightly. "James, what are your instruments showing?" "Temperature's starting to drop," James replied, his voice tight with concentration. "Down to 18 degrees now, and the current meter is reading almost 0. I felt my stomach tighten. The ocean didn't work this way. Currents didn't just stop in the middle of the Pacific. There had to be some kind of massive geological feature or underwater formation causing this, but the surveys hadn't shown anything. "There," Rebecca said, pointing ahead through the front viewport. "Do you see it?" I leaned forward, straining to see what she was looking at. At first, everything looked the same, just the endless blue of deep water. Then I saw it. A line in the water, perfectly straight, where the normal ocean seemed to end. "What the hell is that?" I muttered. The boundary was impossible to miss once you knew where to look. On our side, the water moved normally, particles drifting with the current. But beyond that line, everything was completely still, not just slow, completely motionless, like the water had been frozen in place. "Reducing speed," Rebecca announced. "We're about 200 meters from the edge." James was frantically checking his equipment. "Temperature just dropped another 5 degrees, 15 degrees Celsius now. That's a 7-degree drop in less than 10 minutes. I watched the boundary grow clearer as we approached. The contrast was stark. Living ocean on one side, dead stillness on the other. No fish crossed the line. No particles drifted through it. It was like looking at a wall made of water. "This is impossible," I said, more to myself than to the others. "Water doesn't behave like this." "Tell that to the ocean," Rebecca replied grimly. She brought the submersible to a complete stop about 50 meters from the boundary. "James, are you getting any readings from beyond the line?" "Nothing," James said, his voice strained. "Sonar's not penetrating past the boundary. It's like there's nothing there to bounce off of." I stared at the motionless water ahead of us. In 12 years of marine research, I'd never seen anything like this. The ocean was supposed to be in constant motion. Currents, tides, thermal layers all creating movement. But this water looked like it had been turned to glass. "We need to get closer," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around. Rebecca nodded slowly. "That's what we're here for." She engaged the thrusters, moving us forward at barely a crawl. As we approached the boundary, I could see it even more clearly. The line was perfectly defined, as if someone had drawn it with a ruler. Normal seawater on one side, something else entirely on the other. The still water beyond the line was darker somehow, though I couldn't figure out why. 50 meters, Rebecca announced. 40. 30. James was checking his instruments obsessively. "All readings are going crazy. Temperature sensors can't get a lock on anything beyond the boundary. It's like the water just stops existing." 20 meters from the line, Rebecca brought us to another stop. I could see individual water molecules hanging motionless just beyond the boundary, suspended like they were trapped in amber. It defied every law of physics I knew. "This is it," Rebecca said quietly. "The edge of the deep blue hole." I pressed my face against the porthole, trying to understand what I was seeing. The boundary extended as far as I could see in both directions, a perfect circle of stillness in the living ocean. Beyond it, the water was so dark it looked almost black. "Are we really going in there?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca's hands hovered over the controls. "That's the mission." I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Whatever was beyond that boundary, it wasn't natural. It couldn't be. But we'd come this far, and the scientific part of my mind needed to know what was causing this impossible phenomenon. "Do it," I said. Rebecca engaged the thrusters, and the benthic explorer began moving forward again. The boundary grew larger in our viewports, that perfect line between the normal ocean and whatever lay beyond. 10 meters, 5 meters, 3. The moment our bow crossed the boundary, everything changed. I pressed my face against the porthole as we approached what had to be the most impossible thing I'd ever seen in 12 years of ocean research. The deep blue hole stretched out in front of us like a perfect circle cut from the fabric of reality itself. The boundary was so clean and precise it looked like someone had taken a massive cookie cutter to the ocean floor and just removed a piece. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, watching the edge where normal Pacific water met absolutely nothing. Rebecca adjusted our heading slightly, bringing us closer to the rim. There it is, half a mile across, just like the report said. The contrast was mind-bending. On our left, I could see schools of fish swimming through regular blue-green water, kelp swaying in the current, particles drifting in the normal flow. But on our right, past that razor-sharp boundary, there was just empty space. Not dark water, not murky depths. Actual empty space, like looking into a cave that went on forever. James was frantically checking his instruments, his hands shaking as he adjusted dials and tapped screens. The readings are completely insane. Temperature drops to near freezing right at the edge, but there's no water to measure past the boundary. Sonar just stops working entirely. I couldn't wrap my head around what I was seeing. In all my years studying ocean anomalies, I'd never encountered anything that violated basic physics this completely. Water didn't just end. There had to be something filling that space. More water, sediment, rock, anything. But my eyes were telling me there was literally nothing there. "How is this possible?" I asked, more to myself than anyone else. Rebecca brought us to a hover about 50 feet from the edge. "That's what we're here to find out. James, start recording everything. I want continuous data from the moment we cross that threshold." James nodded, his face pale as he activated the recording equipment. "All systems are logging, but I have to tell you, half our instruments are already giving error messages just being this close." I studied the boundary more carefully, trying to understand what I was looking at. The edge was perfectly vertical, like someone had sliced through the ocean with a knife. I could see where the water ended and the void began, and it made my stomach turn. This wasn't how the world was supposed to work. "We're really going in there?" James asked, his voice cracking slightly. Rebecca checked her controls one more time. "That's the mission. Everyone ready?" I wanted to say no. Every instinct I had was screaming that we shouldn't go anywhere near that thing. But I'd come here to study ocean anomalies, and this was the biggest anomaly anyone had ever discovered. I nodded. "Do it." Rebecca engaged the thrusters, and we moved forward toward the boundary. I watched through the porthole as normal ocean water flowed past us, and then suddenly we crossed the line. The water around our submersible vanished. 1 second we were moving through the Pacific Ocean, and the next second we were falling through empty air. The sensation was immediate and terrifying, like the moment when an elevator cable snaps and you feel your stomach drop. But this kept going. "What the hell?" Rebecca shouted, grabbing the controls as alarms started blaring throughout the cabin. I pressed against the porthole and looked down. Below us was nothing but empty space stretching into darkness. We weren't sinking through water anymore. We were actually falling through air, or vacuum, or whatever filled this impossible void. "The thrusters aren't responding," Rebecca yelled over the alarms. "There's no water for them to push against." James was staring at his instruments in complete panic. We're in free fall! Depth readings are going crazy! We're dropping faster than we should be able to in water! I felt my body pressing against my safety harness as we accelerated downward. This was impossible. Submersibles didn't fall through empty space. They moved through water, which provided resistance and buoyancy. But we were dropping like a stone through air. "Can you get us back to the edge?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Rebecca was fighting with the controls, but nothing was working. The propulsion system is designed for water. Without something to push against, we're just dead weight. The submersible started to spin as we fell, and I caught glimpses of the boundary above us through the porthole. I could see the edge of normal ocean water getting smaller and smaller as we dropped deeper into the void. The circle of real water looked like a distant window now, impossibly far above us. "How deep does this thing go?" James asked, his voice barely audible over the alarms. I looked at the depth gauge and felt my blood run cold. We'd already fallen past 8,000 feet, deeper than we should have been able to go in this part of the Pacific. The ocean floor should have been at around 12,000 feet, but we were dropping through empty space with no bottom in sight. "This can't be happening," I said, watching the depth readings climb higher. 9,000 feet, 10,000, 11,000. Rebecca had stopped trying to control our descent and was just holding onto her seat as we spun through the void. I've never seen anything like this. It's like the laws of physics just stopped working. The spinning was making me dizzy, but I kept watching through the porthole. Sometimes I could see the distant circle of ocean water above us, and sometimes I was looking down into absolute darkness. We were falling through space that shouldn't exist, in a hole that defied everything I knew about how the world worked. 12,000 feet, 13,000. We should have hit the ocean floor by now, but there was nothing below us except more empty space. James was hyperventilating, staring at his instruments. "The readings don't make sense. We're falling through vacuum, but we're not losing pressure in the cabin. How is that possible?" I didn't have an answer. Nothing about this made sense. We were trapped in a submersible, falling through impossible space, with no way to stop our descent and no idea how deep this void actually went. I felt my stomach drop as the submersible started spinning faster, tumbling through the empty space like a coin flipped into a well. The sensation was completely wrong. We should have been moving through water, feeling the resistance and pressure. But instead, we were just falling through nothing. Rebecca's hands flew across the control panel, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering mechanism. Come on," she muttered, trying different combinations of thrusters and stabilizers. The engines whined as they spun up, but without water to push against, they were useless. "The controls aren't responding," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "It's like we're in free fall." That's exactly what we were doing. I pressed my face against the porthole again, watching the boundary of normal ocean water getting smaller above us. We were dropping fast, faster than any submersible should be able to move, even with full power. James was hunched over his instrument panel, frantically checking readings. "This can't be right," he said, tapping the depth gauge with his finger. "We're at 12,000 feet now, 15,000, 20,000. I felt my chest tighten. "That's impossible. The ocean floor should be at 30,000 feet, James interrupted, his voice cracking. 40,000. The numbers just keep climbing. Rebecca tried the emergency ballast release, the one that should have sent us shooting back to the surface. Nothing happened. We kept falling, spinning slowly as we dropped through the void. "How deep does this thing go?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I don't know," Rebecca said. She'd stopped fighting the controls and was just staring out the front viewport. I've never seen anything like this. The spinning made me dizzy, so I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, we were still falling. The depth gauge now read 60,000 feet, deeper than any part of the ocean on Earth. That's when the radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, the kind of interference you'd expect from electronic equipment under stress. But then I heard something else underneath the white noise. A voice. It was faint, barely audible over the static, but definitely human. Or at least, it sounded human. The voice was speaking in a language I'd never heard before, with strange consonants and vowel sounds that seemed to flow together in an unnatural rhythm. "Are you getting this?" I asked Rebecca. She nodded, reaching over to adjust the radio's frequency. The voice became clearer, though the language remained completely foreign. It was chanting something, the same phrases repeated over and over in a steady, hypnotic pattern. James looked up from his instruments. "Where's it coming from?" "I don't know," Rebecca said, checking the radio's display. "It's not on any standard frequency. The signal strength is, well, it doesn't make sense. It's like the transmission is coming from right next to us." The chanting continued, growing slightly louder as we fell deeper. There was something unsettling about the rhythm. It reminded me of a heartbeat, or maybe breathing. The voice rose and fell in waves, sometimes urgent, sometimes almost whisper quiet. "Can you understand any of it?" I asked. Rebecca shook her head. "It's not any language I recognize. Could be some kind of code, maybe?" James was fiddling with the radio controls, trying to isolate the signal. "I'm not picking up any other transmissions, just this one voice." The submersible gave a sudden lurch, and for a moment I thought we'd hit something. But when I looked out the porthole, there was still nothing but empty space around us. We were still falling, still spinning. But something had changed. The chanting was getting louder now, more insistent. The voice seemed to be speaking directly to us, though I couldn't understand a word of it. There was an urgency to the tone that made my skin crawl. 80,000 feet, James reported, his voice barely above a whisper. 90,000. I tried to wrap my head around those numbers. We were falling through a space that shouldn't exist, listening to a voice that couldn't be there, in a situation that violated every law of physics I'd ever learned. The chanting reached a crescendo, the unknown words flowing together in a rapid stream. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The radio went silent, except for the soft hiss of static. We kept falling through the impossible void. The only sound now, the hum of our life support systems and the occasional beep from James's instruments. The depth gauge continued climbing. 100,000 feet, 120,000, numbers that meant nothing in a place where the ocean floor should have been reached long ago. I stared out into the darkness below us, wondering what we were falling toward and whether we'd ever find out. I pressed my face harder against the porthole, trying to make sense of what I was seeing in the darkness below us. At first, I thought it might be the bottom of the void, some kind of massive rock formation or underwater mountain that had somehow ended up in this impossible space. But as we fell closer, spinning through the emptiness, I realized the shape was moving. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. "There's something down there." The thing was huge, bigger than anything I'd ever seen in 12 years of marine research, bigger than a blue whale, bigger than the research vessel we'd left on the surface. Hell, it was bigger than a city block. The shape shifted and undulated in ways that made my eyes water, like my brain couldn't quite process what it was looking at. "What?" Rebecca called out, still fighting with the controls even though we all knew they weren't working. "Look down," I said, pointing through the porthole. "There's something massive down there." James twisted around from his instrument panel, craning his neck to see past me. When he spotted it, his face went white as a sheet. "That's not possible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing that big could exist down here. Nothing that big could exist anywhere." But it was there, and it was moving, not drifting like something dead, moving with purpose, with awareness. Parts of it seemed to pulse and flow like liquid, while other sections looked solid as stone. The whole thing gave off a faint phosphorescent glow that made it visible against the absolute darkness of the void. I felt something cold crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature readings James had been calling out. This wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, more primal. Like every instinct I'd developed over millions of years of evolution was screaming at me to run, to hide, to get as far away from this thing as possible. "How big is it?" Rebecca asked, her voice tight. I tried to estimate, but the scale was all wrong. We were still falling, still getting closer, and the thing just kept getting bigger. What I'd thought was the whole creature turned out to be just a small part of it. The rest stretched out into the darkness in all directions. "I don't know," I said. "Miles, maybe. It's hard to tell." James was hyperventilating again, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. "This isn't real," he kept saying. "This can't be real." The chanting from the radio was getting louder, more insistent. The alien voices seemed to be building towards something, their rhythm matching the pulsing glow of the creature below us. I had the horrible feeling that our descent wasn't random, that we were being drawn down here for a reason. "We need to get out of here," James said suddenly, his voice cracking. "We need to get back to the surface right now." "With what?" Rebecca snapped. "The thrusters don't work. The ballast doesn't work. We're in free fall through empty space." "Then we use the emergency systems," James said, scrambling over his instruments. "There has to be something. Emergency ascent, emergency beacon, something." I watched him frantically pushing buttons and flipping switches, but nothing happened. The submersible just kept falling, spinning slowly as we dropped toward the impossible thing waiting below. The creature was close enough now that I could make out details, though my mind kept rejecting what I was seeing. It had structures that might have been limbs, or tentacles, or something else entirely. Surfaces that looked like they were covered in eyes or mouths, or geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The whole thing seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once, like it was folded in on itself in ways that shouldn't be possible. "Oh God," James whispered, staring down at the thing. "Oh God. Oh God. Oh God." His scientific composure was completely gone. The man who'd been excited about collecting data and making discoveries was now pressed against the wall of the submersible, shaking like a leaf. "James, calm down," Rebecca said, but her own voice was strained. "We need to think this through." "Think what through?" James shouted. "We're falling towards some kind of monster that shouldn't exist, in a hole that shouldn't exist, and our equipment doesn't work, because we're apparently falling through a vacuum that somehow isn't killing us. What exactly are we supposed to think through?" He had a point. Everything about our situation violated the laws of physics as I understood them. We should have been crushed by pressure changes, or frozen in the vacuum, or dead from decompression. Instead, we were just falling, perfectly preserved in our little metal bubble, towards something that my brain kept insisting couldn't be real. The chanting reached a new crescendo, and I felt something change in the air around us. The creature below pulsed brighter, and I could swear it was looking at us. Not with eyes, at least not eyes as I understood them, but with an awareness that made my skin crawl. "It knows we're here," I said. "What?" Rebecca asked. "The thing down there, it knows we're coming." James let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Of course it does. We're probably the first meal it's had in 1,000 years. "Don't say that," Rebecca said sharply. But I was starting to think James might be right. The way the creature was moving, the way the chanting was building, it felt like anticipation, like something that had been waiting a very long time was finally about to get what it wanted. The depth gauge was still climbing. 120,000 feet. 130,000. We were deeper than the deepest ocean trenches on Earth, falling through space that shouldn't exist toward a creature that couldn't be real. James suddenly lunged for the hatch controls. "I'm getting out of here," he said, his hands shaking as he reached for the emergency release. "James, no," Rebecca shouted, but he was already pulling the lever. I watched in horror as James grabbed the hatch wheel and started turning it. The man had completely lost it. We were thousands of feet underwater in an impossible void, and he was trying to open the door. "James, stop!" I yelled, but it was too late. The hatch cracked open with a sound like thunder, and everything changed. I watched in horror as James lunged for the hatch controls, his face twisted with panic. The lever clicked under his grip, and I heard the mechanical whir of the opening mechanism engaging. "James, no!" Rebecca shouted from the pilot's seat, but it was too late. The hatch cracked open with a sound like thunder, and I braced myself for the rush of water that should have flooded our cabin. Instead, something impossible happened. James was yanked from his position with violent force, his body disappearing through the opening in a blur of motion. But no water followed him. I stared at the open hatch, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The void outside seemed to pulse and shift, like it was alive. Then, as if responding to some unseen intelligence, the opening began to seal itself. Not the hatch closing. The void itself was healing around the breach. The darkness outside rippled and flowed like thick liquid, covering the hatch opening completely. Within seconds, the breach was gone, leaving only smooth metal where the opening had been. The cabin pressure held steady, as if nothing had happened. James's screams echoed from somewhere below us, growing fainter as he fell into the abyss. The sound was raw and terrified, cutting through the alien chanting that still poured from our radio. I pressed my hands against my ears, but I couldn't block out his voice as it faded into the distance. "James," I called out, knowing it was useless. His screams continued for what felt like forever, then gradually became whisper quiet, until finally, there was nothing but silence. I stared at where the hatch had been, my hands shaking. The metal surface was perfectly smooth, like it had never been disturbed. I reached out and touched it, solid and cold, completely sealed. "How is this possible?" I whispered. Rebecca had stopped fighting with the controls. Her hands fell to her sides, and she slumped back in the pilot's seat. When she turned to look at me, her face was pale and hollow. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said quietly. "We're not getting out of here." The submersible continued its downward spiral, spinning slowly as we fell deeper into the void. Through the porthole, I could see the massive entity below us growing larger with each passing second. Its phosphorescent glow pulsed in rhythm with the chanting, like a heartbeat made of light. I felt completely paralyzed, unable to move or think clearly. Every instinct told me to do something, anything, but there was nothing left to try. Our thrusters were dead. Our ballast system had failed. And now James was gone, swallowed by whatever forces controlled this impossible place. The chanting from the radio reached a crescendo, filling the cabin with sounds that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my bones. The alien voices rose and fell in patterns that hurt to listen to, like they were speaking words that human minds weren't meant to process. I watched the depth gauge climb past numbers that shouldn't exist. 150,000 feet, 200,000, still climbing. We were falling through space that couldn't be there, towards something that defied every law of physics I'd ever learned. The creature below us was becoming more defined as we approached. I could make out what looked like massive tentacles or appendages, each one easily the size of a city block. They moved with deliberate purpose, reaching upward as if welcoming our descent. Rebecca sat motionless in her chair, staring down at the approaching entity with empty eyes. She'd given up completely, and I couldn't blame her. There was nothing left to fight against, no controls that worked, no escape route that made sense. The submersible shuddered as we fell faster, the metal hull groaning under stresses it was never designed to handle. But somehow we held together, protected by the same impossible forces that had sealed the hatch and kept us alive in this airless void. The chanting reached its peak volume, so loud now that I could feel it in my chest like a physical weight. I watched Rebecca slump back in her pilot seat, her hands falling away from the controls like dead weight. The fight had gone out of her completely. She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Total defeat. "We're not getting out of this," she said quietly. Her voice was flat, matter of fact. "Neither of us." I wanted to argue with her, to tell her we'd find a way, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, and my hands were shaking against the porthole glass. Below us, that thing, whatever it was, kept growing larger. The phosphorescent glow pulsed through the water like a heartbeat, and I could make out more details now. Massive tentacles or appendages writhed in slow motion, each one thicker than a subway tunnel. The chanting from the radio had gotten so loud it seemed to vibrate through the hull itself. I could feel it in my bones, in my teeth. The alien words, if they were words, repeated in patterns that made my head hurt. Rebecca wasn't even trying to adjust the frequency anymore. She just sat there, staring down at the creature through her own viewport. "How deep are we now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Rebecca glanced at the depth gauge without much interest. 160,000 feet, give or take. That was impossible. The deepest part of any ocean on Earth was maybe 36,000 feet. We were falling through something that shouldn't exist, towards something that couldn't be real. But there it was, getting bigger every second. I pressed my face harder against the porthole, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature's surface wasn't smooth. It had structures on it, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. They shifted and changed as I watched, like they were rearranging themselves. Or maybe my brain just couldn't process what it was actually seeing. "Marcus," Rebecca said. I turned to look at her. She was still staring down at the thing below us. "I'm sorry I brought you on this mission." "Don't," I said. "Don't talk like that." But even as I said it, I knew she was right. We were falling faster now. I could feel it in my stomach, that weightless sensation you get in an elevator that's moving too fast. The submersible's hull groaned around us, metal stress sounds that shouldn't be happening at any depth. Yet somehow we weren't being crushed. The void around us seemed to pulse with its own life. The darkness wasn't just empty space anymore. It moved, shifted, like we were falling through the inside of something alive. The chanting grew louder, and I started to hear other sounds underneath it. Whispers, maybe, or screaming. I couldn't tell which. I tried to think clearly, to use my scientific training to make sense of what was happening. But every time I focused on one detail, my mind seemed to slide away from it. The creature below us defied every law of physics I knew. It was too big, too complex, too impossible to exist. "Look at the readings," Rebecca said, pointing at her instruments with a shaky finger. I leaned over to see the displays. The temperature gauge was fluctuating wildly. 1 second it read near freezing. The next, it spiked to over 100 degrees. The pressure readings made no sense either, jumping between normal atmospheric pressure and readings that should have crushed us instantly. The sonar was just static now, white noise that added to the alien chorus, filling our cabin. The submersible shuddered, and I grabbed onto my seat. Through the porthole, I could see we were getting close enough to make out individual features on the creature's surface. What I'd thought were geometric patterns were actually openings, holes or mouths or something worse. They opened and closed in rhythm with the chanting, like the thing was breathing through them. "It knows we're here," I whispered. Rebecca nodded slowly. "It's been waiting for us." That thought hit me like ice water. Waiting for us. Not just waiting, expecting us. The radio chanting, the way the void had sealed itself after James fell through, the impossible physics that kept us alive while we plummeted toward this thing. None of it was random. We weren't just falling into some natural phenomenon. We were being delivered. The creature's glow intensified, and suddenly I could see it clearly. My mind recoiled from what I was looking at, but I couldn't look away. It wasn't just big, it was vast beyond comprehension. The tentacles I'd seen were just the smallest appendages. The main body stretched out in all directions, disappearing into the darkness. And those openings on its surface weren't mouths. They were eyes. Hundreds of them, thousands, all turning to focus on our tiny submersible. I felt something change in the air around us. The pressure, the temperature, even the way sound traveled. Everything shifted at once. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving us in a silence that was somehow worse than the noise had been. In that silence, I heard something else. A voice, but not through the radio. It was inside my head, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Welcome." The word echoed through my thoughts, and with it came images that made no sense. Vast cities underwater, beings that moved through dimensions like we move through rooms, knowledge that would drive a human mind to madness just by existing. I saw the earth from impossible angles, saw time flowing backward and forward simultaneously, saw the thin barriers between realities cracking and bleeding. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision started to blur at the edges, and I felt my consciousness slipping away like water through my fingers. The last thing I saw clearly was Rebecca, still sitting in her pilot seat, her eyes wide and staring at something I couldn't see. Her mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. The creature's presence filled my mind completely now, pushing out everything else. My memories, my thoughts, my sense of self, all of it was being overwhelmed by something so alien and vast that my brain simply couldn't contain it. I felt myself falling not just through space, but through layers of reality I hadn't known existed. The submersible was still descending, still accelerating toward the impossible entity below. But I was no longer really there to experience it. My consciousness was fragmenting, breaking apart under the weight of contact with something that existed beyond human understanding. The last coherent thought I had was a desperate hope that whatever happened next, it would be quick. Then everything went black, and I knew nothing more. The last thing I remembered was staring at that massive creature through the porthole, watching those countless eyes focus on our submersible as we fell toward it. The chanting had stopped, replaced by that voice in my head saying, "Welcome." And then everything just went black. I tried to piece together what happened next, but there was nothing. No memory of impact, no sensation of the submersible hitting the creature or the bottom of the void. No recollection of what the entity did to us or how our descent ended. It was like someone had taken an eraser to that part of my mind and wiped it completely clean. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to force the memories back. Had we crashed into the creature? Had it grabbed our submersible with those writhing appendages? The harder I concentrated, the more my head started to pound. There was just this blank space where the most important moments should have been. Rebecca had been sitting right next to me in the pilot's seat. She'd been staring at the creature too, her mouth moving like she was trying to say something. But I couldn't remember hearing her voice, or what happened to her after that. James was already gone by then, fallen into the abyss when he'd opened the hatch. But Rebecca, she'd been right there with me when everything went dark. I tried to remember the sensation of falling, the way the submersible had been spinning as we dropped through that impossible void. The depth gauge had been climbing to numbers that shouldn't exist, 160,000 feet, deeper than any ocean trench on Earth. But after that voice spoke in my head, after those incomprehensible images flooded my consciousness, there was just nothing. The void itself was a mystery I couldn't solve. We'd been falling through empty space where water should have been, defying every law of physics I understood. The creature below us had been massive beyond comprehension, its phosphorescent glow illuminating geometric patterns that shifted and changed across its surface. Those patterns had been openings, eyes, I'd realized, all of them watching us descend. I rubbed my forehead, feeling a dull ache behind my eyes. Whatever had happened down there, my mind seemed determined to keep it locked away. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe some experiences were too overwhelming for human consciousness to process and retain. But the not knowing was almost worse than any memory could have been. The chanting from the radio had been so loud it vibrated through the hull of the submersible. Then that sudden silence, followed by the voice that spoke directly into my thoughts. The images that came with it had been alien, incomprehensible, knowledge that my brain couldn't categorize or understand. And then darkness. I wondered if Rebecca had experienced the same thing. Had she heard that voice too? Had her mind also been flooded with those impossible visions before everything went black? Or had something different happened to her? The questions multiplied in my head, but I had no way to answer them. The missing time felt like a wound in my memory. I could recall every detail leading up to that moment. The creature's eyes focusing on us, the way the submersible shuddered as we fell, Rebecca's pale face in the glow from the instruments. But the actual encounter, the moment when we reached the bottom of that void, was completely gone. I tried to think about what forces could have acted on us during those lost moments. Had the creature communicated with us somehow? Had it done something to our minds, our memories? The voice that had spoken to me suggested some kind of intelligence, something that could reach into human consciousness. But beyond that, I had nothing. The fragments that remained were mostly emotional. Terror, confusion, a sense of being completely overwhelmed by something beyond human understanding. But the actual events, the physical reality of what happened when we reached the entity, remained locked away in some inaccessible part of my mind. I sat there trying to force the memories back, but it was like trying to grab smoke. The harder I reached for them, the more they seemed to slip away. Whatever had happened in those final moments of our descent into the deep blue hole, my mind had decided I wasn't meant to remember it. I woke up choking on salt water, my lungs burning as I coughed up what felt like half the Pacific Ocean. The taste of brine filled my mouth, and my eyes stung from the salt. I was floating on my back, staring up at a gray sky that looked completely normal. No void, no impossible darkness, just regular clouds drifting overhead. My body felt heavy and waterlogged, like I'd been in the ocean for hours. I tried to remember how I'd gotten here, but there was nothing. One moment I was in the submersible with Rebecca, watching that massive creature through the porthole, and then blank. Complete emptiness where my memories should be. I treaded water and looked around, trying to get my bearings. About 200 yards away, I could see the deep current floating on the surface. The research vessel looked exactly the same as when we'd left it. No damage, no signs of distress. Just sitting there like nothing had happened. How was I here? How had I gotten out of the submersible? The last thing I remembered was losing consciousness as that voice echoed in my head, and Rebecca sitting in the pilot's seat with her eyes wide. Now I was floating alone on the surface with no idea how I'd survived. I started swimming toward the ship, my waterlogged clothes making every stroke difficult. My arms felt weak, like I'd been unconscious for a long time. The water around me was normal Pacific blue-green, nothing like the impossible void we'd fallen through. No sign of the deep blue hole anywhere. "Man overboard!" someone shouted from the deck of the deep current. I could see crew members running to the rail, pointing in my direction. Within minutes, they had a rescue boat in the water. 2 crew members I didn't recognize pulled me from the ocean and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I was shivering, though I couldn't tell if it was from cold or shock. "Dr. Chen, what happened?" one of them asked as they helped me into the boat. "Where's the submersible? Where are Dr. Henslow and Dr. Callahan?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? I tried to piece together what had happened after we'd encountered the creature, but there was nothing there. Just a blank space where the most important part should be. "I don't know," I finally managed to say. "I can't remember." They got me back to the deep current and helped me onto the deck. Captain Morrison was waiting with a medical kit and a concerned expression. Several other crew members gathered around, all asking questions I couldn't answer. "Where's the benthic explorer?" Morrison asked, scanning the water around us. "We lost radio contact 3 hours ago." 3 hours. I'd been unconscious for 3 hours, somehow floating on the surface while Rebecca and James were... where? Still down there? Dead? I had no idea. "They're still down there," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. "In the hole. Something happened." Morrison looked at me like I was talking nonsense. "What hole?" "Dr. Chen, you're not making sense. We've been monitoring the area. There's nothing unusual on sonar." I looked out at the water where the deep blue hole should be. The ocean looked completely normal. No boundary line, no temperature drop, no void. Just regular Pacific water stretching to the horizon. "Check the coordinates," I said, my voice getting stronger. "The deep blue hole coordinates. It was right here." Morrison nodded to one of the crew members, who ran to check the navigation equipment. He came back shaking his head. "We're at the exact coordinates, Captain. Sonar shows normal ocean floor at 8,000 feet. No anomalies." That was impossible. The hole had been half a mile across, a perfect circle of emptiness. We'd fallen through it for what felt like hours, descending to depths that shouldn't exist. How could it just be gone? "Run a full sweep," Morrison ordered. "Look for any sign of the submersible or debris." I sat on a crate, still wrapped in the blanket, watching the crew work. They deployed every piece of search equipment they had: sonar, underwater cameras, even diving gear for shallow searches. But I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever had happened down there, whatever that creature was, it existed in a place that normal instruments couldn't detect. "Dr. Chen," Morrison said, sitting down next to me. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Start from when you entered the water." I tried to organize my thoughts, but they felt scattered and incomplete. We found the hole. It was exactly like the report said. A perfect circle where the water just stopped. We went in, and we started falling through empty space. Morrison's expression grew more concerned. Falling through what? There was no water inside the hole. We were in free fall, like we'd been dropped from an airplane. The depth gauge showed us going deeper than any ocean trench. And there was something down there. Something massive. I could see Morrison exchanging glances with the other crew members. They thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Dr. Chen, you've been through a trauma. Sometimes the mind creates false memories to cope with. I'm not making this up, I interrupted. Rebecca and James saw it too. There was a creature down there, bigger than anything that should exist. It was aware of us. It spoke to me. The crew continued their search while Morrison tried to get more details from me. But every time I reached for the memories of what happened after the creature spoke, there was nothing. It was like someone had taken an eraser to that part of my mind. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky while they searched every square foot of ocean in a 5-mile radius. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no sign that the benthic explorer had ever existed. How is this possible? I asked Morrison as we watched the sun start to set. A submersible doesn't just vanish. Equipment failures happen, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Maybe they had a catastrophic hull breach. The ocean is deep here. If they sank fast enough, we might never find them. But I knew that wasn't what had happened. The submersible hadn't sunk in any normal sense. It had fallen through impossible space into the domain of something that shouldn't exist. And somehow, for reasons I couldn't understand, I'd been sent back to the surface while Rebecca and James remained trapped below. The search continued into the night, with floodlights illuminating the water around us. I stood at the rail, staring down into the dark ocean, trying to remember how I'd escaped. But there was nothing there, just a void in my memory as empty as the hole we'd fallen through. I watched Captain Morrison deploy every piece of search equipment the deep current had. The crew lowered underwater cameras, ran sonar sweeps, and sent down diving gear to check the coordinates where the deep blue hole should have been. I stood at the rail, wrapped in that scratchy wool blanket, watching them work. The sonar readings came back normal, 8,000 feet to the ocean floor, just like any other patch of Pacific water. No void, no impossible depths, no sign of the benthic explorer or Rebecca or James. Nothing down there but sand and rock, Morrison said, checking the display for the third time. Water temperature's normal. Currents are flowing like they should. Whatever you think you saw, I know what I saw. My voice came out hoarse. There was a hole, a perfect circle, half a mile across. We fell through it for hours. Morrison exchanged glances with his first mate, the kind of look people give when they think someone's lost their mind. Dr. Chen, you've been through trauma. Sometimes the brain tries to make sense of things by creating false memories. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him. The hole had been right here. We'd descended into that impossible void, seen that massive entity with its phosphorescent patterns and countless eyes, but standing on the deck of the deep current, staring at normal ocean water, even I started to doubt what I remembered. The search continued for 3 days. Morrison had the crew check a 5-mile radius around the coordinates, thinking maybe we'd drifted off course. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no emergency beacon signals. The benthic explorer had simply vanished, along with Rebecca and James. On the second day, I tried explaining what had happened inside the hole, how we'd fallen through empty space instead of water. how the depth gauge had read over 160,000 feet. How that thing down there had spoken directly into my mind. The crew listened politely, but I could see it in their faces. They thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Morrison suggested I might have hit my head when the submersible surfaced, that I could be suffering from a concussion or decompression sickness. "But I don't remember surfacing," I told him. "I don't remember anything after that voice in my head. I just woke up floating in the ocean." "Memory loss is common with head trauma," Morrison said. "The important thing is, you're alive." But that was the problem. Why was I alive? Why had I been expelled from that void while Rebecca and James remained trapped down there? The guilt ate at me worse than the fear. I'd been the one to give the order to cross the boundary. I'd led them into that nightmare. By the fourth day, Morrison called off the search. The Coast Guard had been notified, and they'd run their own sweep of the area. Nothing. The official report would list the Benthic Explorer as lost at sea, cause unknown. Rebecca and James would be declared missing, presumed dead. I stood at the rail as the deep current turned toward shore. The ocean looked completely normal. Waves rolled in their usual patterns. Seabirds dove for fish, and the water sparkled blue-green under the afternoon sun. No one looking at this spot would ever guess what lay beneath. But I knew. I'd seen that entity with my own eyes, felt its presence in my mind. It was still down there in that impossible void, waiting. The hole might be invisible to sonar and cameras, but it existed. The creature existed. Morrison found me at the rail as we headed back to port. "You should talk to someone when we get back," he said. "A counselor, maybe a psychiatrist. What you've been through, losing your colleagues like that, it's not something you should handle alone." I nodded, but I knew no counselor would believe me. No one would. I was the only person who'd seen the truth and lived to tell it, and that truth sounded like the ravings of a madman. The deep current's engines hummed as we sailed away from the coordinates. I kept staring back at the water, knowing that somewhere beneath those normal-looking waves, Rebecca and James were still down there. Dead or alive, I couldn't say. But they were down there with that thing, in a place that shouldn't exist. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and watched the spot where the deep blue hole had been until it disappeared over the horizon. The knowledge of what I'd seen would stay with me forever. That entity was real, and it was waiting in the depths, patient and ancient and hungry. No matter how normal the ocean looked from the surface, I would never forget what lurked beneath. The deep current's engines rumbled beneath my feet as we pulled into San Diego Harbor. I'd been standing at the rail for the past hour, watching the coastline grow larger, dreading what waited for me on shore. The wool blanket was still wrapped around my shoulders. I hadn't taken it off since they pulled me from the water 4 days ago. Captain Morrison walked up beside me, clipboard in hand. "You ready for this, Doc?" I wasn't ready for anything. The Coast Guard had radioed ahead. There'd be officials waiting, families wanting answers, reporters probably. All of them expecting me to explain what happened to Rebecca and James. "They're going to ask the same questions," Morrison said quietly. "Just stick to what you told me." What I told him was the truth, but I knew how it sounded. A hole in the ocean that defied physics, a creature the size of a city block. My colleagues falling into a void that shouldn't exist. Morrison had been kind about it, suggesting trauma and decompression sickness, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The dock was already crowded when we tied up. I could see the official vehicles, Coast Guard, Navy, and what looked like federal agents in dark suits. Behind them stood 2 people I recognized from the research photos, Rebecca's sister and James's father. My stomach dropped. A Coast Guard commander was the first to board. He introduced himself as Commander Walsh and asked me to come with him for debriefing. I followed him down the gangplank, still wrapped in that damn blanket, feeling like I was walking to my execution. The questioning started immediately in a small office at the harbor. 3 officials sat across from me: Walsh, a Navy investigator named Carter, and a woman from the National Science Foundation who didn't give her name. They had recording equipment and thick folders. "Dr. Chen, can you walk us through the events of the dive?" Walsh asked. I told them everything. The boundary where the ocean stopped, the fall through empty space, the creature with its geometric patterns and impossible size, the voice in my head, waking up, floating alone on the surface. They exchanged glances throughout my account. Carter took notes, but kept shaking his head slightly. The NSF woman asked me to repeat certain parts, her tone growing more skeptical each time. "Dr. Chen," she finally said, "you're describing physical impossibilities. Water doesn't just stop flowing. Objects don't fall through ocean voids. The depth readings you mentioned would put you below the Earth's crust." "I know how it sounds," I said, "but that's what happened." Walsh leaned forward. "The sonar readings from your vessel show normal ocean floor at those coordinates. 8,000 feet deep, standard Pacific Basin geology. No anomalies whatsoever." "Then explain how I ended up in the water," I said. "Explain what happened to the benthic explorer and my colleagues." "Equipment failure," Carter suggested. "Rapid ascent, explosive decompression. You could have been thrown clear during the accident. The trauma would explain the hallucinations." They weren't hallucinations. The questioning went on for 3 hours. They asked the same things over and over, trying to find inconsistencies in my story. When I stuck to the truth, they started suggesting I seek psychiatric evaluation. By the end, I could tell they'd already decided what really happened. A tragic accident caused by equipment failure, with the sole survivor suffering from severe psychological trauma. Outside the office, Rebecca's sister was waiting. Sarah Henslow looked exactly like Rebecca but younger, with the same sharp green eyes. Those eyes were red from crying. "Dr. Chen?" she said, standing up from a plastic chair. "I'm Sarah, Rebecca's sister." I wanted to disappear. I'm so sorry about Rebecca. What really happened out there?" Her voice was steady, but I could hear the pain underneath. "The officials won't tell me anything except that there was an accident." I looked around. The officials were still in the office, probably discussing my mental state. "Can we walk outside?" We went out to the parking lot. Sarah lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Rebecca called me the night before the dive. She was excited about this discovery, said it could change everything we know about oceanography. Now they're telling me she's dead, and you're the only one who came back." "I tried to save them," I said. "When James opened the hatch, I tried to grab him, but he fell. And Rebecca, she was right there next to me when that thing spoke to us. I don't know why I'm the only one who made it out." Sarah stared at me. "What thing?" I realized I'd said too much. The officials had made it clear they thought I was delusional. If I told Rebecca's sister about the creature, she'd think the same thing. "I'm sorry," I said. "The doctors think I have some memory issues from the accident." But Sarah stepped closer. "No, you said that thing spoke to us. What did you mean?" I looked into her eyes and saw something I hadn't seen from anyone else. She wanted to believe me. Maybe because the alternative was accepting that her sister died in some random equipment failure. "There was something down there," I said quietly. "Something that shouldn't exist. It was waiting for us." Sarah took a long drag from her cigarette. The officials said you were hallucinating. I know what I saw. She studied my face for a long moment. Rebecca always said the ocean still had secrets. Big ones. She dropped the cigarette and crushed it under her heel. I don't think you're crazy, Dr. Chen. I think something happened out there that they don't want to admit. Before I could respond, James's father appeared. Robert Callahan was a tall man with the same reddish hair as his son, but gray at the temples. His face was hard, angry. "You're Chen," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Callahan, I'm sorry for your loss." "Sorry?" His voice was getting louder. "My son is dead, and you're walking around wrapped in a blanket talking about sea monsters. What kind of scientist are you?" "Dad, please." A younger woman appeared beside him. Probably James's sister. She put a hand on his arm. "This isn't helping." "He was supposed to keep them safe," Callahan said, pointing at me. "He was the senior researcher. And now my boy is gone and this man is spinning fairy tales about holes in the ocean." I didn't know what to say. He was right about one thing. I was supposed to keep them safe. I was the senior researcher. I should have stopped James from opening that hatch. I should have insisted we turn back when we saw the boundary. "I tried to save him," I said, "by letting him fall into your imaginary void." Callahan's face was red now. "The Coast Guard told me what you've been saying. Equipment failure. That's what killed my son. Not some monster from your damaged brain." His daughter pulled him away before he could say more, but I could hear him talking loudly as they walked to their car. 30 years I worked to send that boy to college, and this is what happens. Some lunatic gets him killed and makes up stories about it. Sarah was still standing beside me. "Don't listen to him. He's hurting." "He's right, though," I said. "I was supposed to bring them back. You couldn't have known what would happen. But I could have. The signs were all there. The boundary where current stopped, the temperature drop, the sonar readings that made no sense. Any reasonable scientist would have turned back. Instead, I'd been curious. I'd wanted to understand the impossible thing we'd found. That curiosity had killed my colleagues. The next few weeks were a nightmare. The official report came out declaring the Benthic Explorer lost due to equipment failure. Rebecca and James were listed as presumed dead. I was recommended for psychological evaluation and placed on administrative leave from the university. The media picked up the story. "Sole survivor of deep-sea tragedy claims monster attack." The headlines made me sound like a lunatic. My colleagues started avoiding me. Students whispered when I walked past. The university suggested I take an extended sabbatical. Dr. Patricia Vance, the department head, called me into her office on a Thursday morning. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes, but she looked uncomfortable as I sat down across from her desk. "Marcus, I've known you for 8 years, she said. "You're one of our best researchers. But this situation..." "I know how it looks," I said. "The families are asking questions. The media won't leave us alone. And your account of what happened..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The review board thinks you need time to recover from your trauma. They think I'm crazy. They think you experienced something terrible and your mind is trying to process it in ways that don't align with physical reality." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Physical reality. Right. "Marcus, I want to help you, but you have to meet me halfway here. The things you're describing, holes in the ocean, creatures that speak telepathically, they're not possible. Then explain how I ended up floating alone on the surface." "Equipment failure, rapid ascent. You were thrown clear during the accident and suffered a head injury. The hallucinations are your brain's way of filling in the gaps. It was the same explanation everyone gave. Clean, rational, impossible to disprove. The only problem was that I knew it wasn't true. Take the sabbatical, Dr. Vance said. Get some help. When you're ready to discuss what really happened out there, we'll talk about bringing you back. I cleaned out my office that afternoon. 12 years of research, awards, published papers, all of it meaningless now. My graduate students looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. Word had gotten around about my breakdown. The apartment felt too quiet after that. I'd lived alone for years, but now the silence was oppressive. I found myself checking news reports obsessively, looking for any mention of unusual ocean activity near the deep blue hole coordinates. There was nothing. I tried to return to normal research, working on some papers I'd been writing before the expedition. But every time I looked at oceanographic data, I thought about that boundary where the laws of physics stopped working. Every depth chart reminded me of falling through impossible space. Every temperature reading made me remember the creature's phosphorescent patterns. Sleep became difficult. When I did manage to drift off, I dreamed about the void. Sometimes I was falling again, watching James disappear into the darkness. Sometimes I was floating on the surface, calling for Rebecca, while the creature's voice echoed in my head. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, checking the time on my phone, always written out as numbers, never digits, because even that small detail reminded me of the depth gauge reading 160,000 feet. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to the captain, was the psychiatrist the university recommended. She had a calm voice and an office filled with plants, designed to be soothing. I sat in her leather chair twice a week and told her about the nightmares. Survivor's guilt is common in situations like this, she said during our 4th session. You feel responsible for your colleagues' deaths, so your mind has created an elaborate scenario where you were powerless to save them. What if it's not survivor's guilt? I asked. What if I'm telling the truth? Marcus, I've read the official reports. The physical evidence doesn't support your account. The physical evidence was destroyed when the hole disappeared. She made a note in her file. You believe the hole disappeared? I know it did. That's why they can't find any trace of the submersible. Or the submersible was destroyed in an equipment failure and sank to the ocean floor where it's buried under sediment. Round and round we went. She was kind about it, but I could see the same doubt in her eyes that I'd seen in everyone else. The rational explanation was so much easier to accept than the truth. Months passed. The media attention died down. The families stopped calling. My colleagues stopped asking how I was doing. I became a cautionary tale, the brilliant scientist who cracked under pressure and invented an elaborate delusion to cope with tragedy. I tried to go back to the ocean once. A former student invited me on a research cruise studying kelp forests off the California coast. Shallow water, safe diving, nothing like the deep Pacific. I thought maybe I could ease back into it. But when I saw the dark water stretching to the horizon, my hands started shaking. When they lowered the first piece of equipment over the side, I had to grip the rail to keep from falling. The sound of the winch reminded me of the Benthic Explorer's launch sequence. The splash when the equipment hit the water made me think of James falling into the void. I made an excuse about feeling seasick and spent the rest of the trip in my cabin. The student was understanding, but I could see the pity in his eyes. Word would get around that Dr. Chen couldn't even handle a simple kelp study anymore. That was when I knew my career was over. Not officially. The university kept me on sabbatical, hoping I'd eventually recover. But I couldn't look at the ocean without seeing that perfect circular boundary. I couldn't read depth charts without remembering the impossible readings. I couldn't hear sonar pings without thinking about the creature's geometric patterns. The worst part was the knowledge that it was still down there. Whatever that thing was, whatever impossible space it inhabited, it hadn't disappeared just because the hole was gone. It was waiting in the depths, patient and alien and utterly beyond human understanding. Sometimes I'd drive out to the coast and stand on the cliffs, looking west toward the coordinates where we'd found the deep blue hole. The ocean looked normal from up there. Blue water stretching to the horizon, waves breaking against the rocks below. But I knew better. I knew what lurked beneath that peaceful surface. The entity had spoken to me. It had said welcome, in a voice that bypassed my ears and went straight into my brain. It had shown me images I couldn't understand, sensations that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. And then it had let me go. Why? Why had I survived when Rebecca and James didn't? The question haunted me more than any nightmare. Had the creature chosen me for some reason? Was I supposed to remember, to carry the knowledge of its existence back to the surface world? If so, I'd failed. No one believed me. The truth had died with my colleagues in that impossible void. I stopped seeing Dr. Morrison after 6 months. She'd done her best, but there was no therapy for what I'd experienced. No treatment for the knowledge that everything we thought we knew about the ocean was wrong. The university finally made my sabbatical permanent. They called it early retirement due to medical reasons. The pension was generous. They wanted to make sure I didn't cause any more embarrassment. I signed the papers without reading them. My apartment lease was up for renewal, but I couldn't stay in San Diego anymore. Too many reminders, too many colleagues who looked at me with pity or suspicion. I found a small house in Colorado, as far from the ocean as I could get. Mountains and forests, no water deeper than a creek. But even there, in the thin air of the Rockies, I could feel it. The creature's presence, vast and patient, waiting in the depths of an ocean 2,000 miles away. It knew I was alive. It knew I remembered. And somehow, I knew it wasn't finished with me. The moving truck pulled away from my new house on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I stood in the empty living room, surrounded by boxes, trying to convince myself that distance would help, that maybe if I stayed away from the ocean long enough, the memories would fade. But I knew better. The deep blue hole was gone, but the entity remained. And no matter how far I ran, I would always carry the knowledge of what waited in the impossible depths where physics broke down and ancient things stirred in the darkness.